Many thanks for joining us in News Center. In 2013, creating about 1 million jobs was a promise of the Jubilee administration. 5 years later, unemployment has actually increased. In fact, of the 1 million youth who get into the workforce every year, only about 1 in 5 is likely to get formal employment, leaving the rest to either unemployment or entrepreneurship therein. But entrepreneurship has also faced several challenges: unfavorable business conditions, a decline in access to capital and funds as well. What promises do you hear as an entrepreneur in the promises being made by President Uhuru Kenyatta?
Well, I think the first thing that was very apparent is he wants to solve the problem of financing. I think that's been one of the biggest problems that we have faced. If you look at the requirements from the formal lending institutions, that ask for 3 years history.
Right.
Where do you get 3 years history if you're a startup company? And then if you look at the more advanced, like private equity and the like, they require people with a lot more knowledge on finance and how to present their cases. And I don't think that's part of our formal education within the local system. So you end up having quite a bit of a gap with respect to that.
Right. What difference do you think it's going to make now, considering the 14% rate cap on interest rates within banks, and that has really made it more difficult for small businesses to get access to capital?
Our hope is that as the discussions go on, there will be a lot of feedback from the challenges that we are facing when looking for financing that will be able to feed back into the process, so that maybe banks can look at different ways of measuring risk for these startup companies.
Right.
Or if the government is providing funds for that purpose, then to have a lot more sensitization to the youth and to the young companies as to how they can access those funds, all the processes involved, make it a bit simpler for the people starting businesses to be able to thrive.
Right, and of course, among the president's vision in this is to ensure that small and medium-sized enterprises can then employ other youth in a bid to reduce the rate of unemployment in the country. But what challenges are entrepreneurs facing other than access to capital that need to be addressed, perhaps in terms of management of specific businesses?
I think one of the big ones as well is with regards to mentorship and access to markets. So you'll find someone has a very good product, but when they go out into the general market, they have no idea who to talk to.
Right.
Those doors don't necessarily open for these small companies, so they find it really hard to break in. So with a sort of mentorship program, a sort of access to markets for these younger people would help quite a bit with regards to fulfilling those goals.
Right. And access to markets has been expanded, wouldn't you say, especially within the East African community. During his inauguration speech, the president pretty much announced an opening up of borders within the East African community, welcoming East African, the East African community to do business in Kenya. How has that impacted small and medium-sized enterprises in terms of access to markets?
So there's a bigger pie out there. But at the same time, I think you'll end up having the big companies still vying for that part of the pie.
Right.
So the small companies get affected in that if they go out, for example, to tender for one of these opportunities that come up, their history, company history, the background of the people there is such that they would never pass through the onerous requirements, or very few of them pass through those onerous requirements to win those public tenders.
Right.
So while the pie is getting bigger, it's up to the government and the private sector to provide proper mentorship programs, proper education to these small companies to enable them to compete effectively against the established businesses.
Right. And of course, the bigger aspect would be to reduce the cost of doing business, the cost of production, the cost of whatever business chain they're in. Has there been an improvement, would you say, within the last 5 years in reducing the cost of business, and what more needs to be done?
Well, if you just look at things like e-citizen that make it a bit easier, rather than queuing up in City Hall or other government offices for an extended period of time, some of the online access to the administrative aspects has made things a bit easier, has lowered costs a bit. If you look at iTax, for example, when reporting your taxes, that's also made things a bit easier. but I think there's still a way to go with regards to lowering the cost of business, particularly for businesses run by young individuals, given that they don't have a lot of background, given that they don't have the right kind of contacts to let them know what to do about taxes, what to do about different government costs. There's still a lot of sensitization and other efforts that can be made to lower their costs of doing business here.
Right. And one of the measures that the government has embarked on is, as of March next year, I believe small and medium-sized enterprises will be able to access reduced costs of power. What difference do you think that is likely to make in small and medium-sized enterprises?
That's particularly for people in production and people that have warehouses or large-scale plans to enable them to run their businesses.
Right.
So I don't know what percentage that is, but those people will definitely benefit a lot from that.
I believe it's about 50%.
Yeah, so those ones will definitely benefit a lot from that because they can change their hours of operation to then lower their cost base. But for a lot of the other ones, it doesn't factor too much if you're providing different kinds of services.
Right. The bigger vision for President Uhuru Kenyatta under Vision 2030 again is to make Kenya a 24-hour economy. SME is an integral part of that. What would you say needs to be done to foster that growth, to make Kenya or lead Kenya to the path of being a 24-hour economy?
I think one of the key things would be to lower the barriers to entry for a lot of these younger businesses. You could find our next, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg is sitting out there somewhere in iHub without access to markets for his products, without the right kind of mentorship to grow. So as we increase the level of information to our young people, access to markets for our young people, I think that should be able to drive us forward in that direction.
So talking about access to markets, of course, you've spoken about opening up of borders within the East African community. Intra-African trade has also been a conversation going on within the country. Are African entrepreneurs, especially the youth just getting into business, able to access or able to network with people from outside our regional economic zones?
I think one good thing about social media is that we do get to know what's happening within the neighboring countries. So with regards to that, if we see a challenge facing Kenya, personally, when I look at my company, I look at challenges facing Kenya, and then I look at what can we do to extend the same to Tanzania, to Uganda, to Rwanda, such that if the opportunity were to be there for us to open up offices or locations in those markets, we can thrive just as well as we've done here. So I do think social media has been a good information
for the same.
Yeah.
But in terms of fostering job creation, of course, devolution has played a big role in that, with less rural to urban migration now being seen, with more people starting up businesses within their own counties. Let's talk about inter-county trade, which is now being championed by various governors across the country. Has devolution made an impact in small and medium-sized enterprises?
That one I'd say has been a big one, for at least for us. Being able to access regional governments to go and give proposals to them has made it much easier. Regional governments are a lot more accessible than the national government. So at least with regards to initiatives, it's been a lot easier to reach out to them, get things started. They've also come out a lot to the local communities, trying to find out how they can help. So they've taken in a lot of feedback from some of the smaller, medium-sized opportunities within their counties to try and exploit them to grow their counties.
Right. There's several funds within the devolved system of governance, the Ways of Funds, the Youth and Women's Funds, that are expected to help young people just starting out in businesses in this. But there's been a lot of challenges, I beg your pardon, that have been noted in that. Many saying the money doesn't actually get to the ground, or there has been a breakdown in the cycle because the money is expected to be paid back immediately. So it's a trend where groups get money or capital to start a business, but the business doesn't take off, and so there isn't that money to pay back into this same cycle. Are these funds beneficial for the young Kenyan, or do they need to be rethought in terms of structure and distribution?
So they're very beneficial. I'd start off with that. I wouldn't want them scrapped. But yes, there can be changes put into the way they are administered. As I said in the beginning, access to information is a big problem for some of these small companies. So you'll find the funds are available within their county, but when you talk to some of the smaller, medium-sized businesses, people struggle to find out, how do I access these funds? What do I fill in? What do I need to do? And then you find a really onerous list of requirements that you need to fulfill to enable you to get those funds. So maybe a bit more education to the youth with regards to how do you go through all these processes to access the funds themselves, and then a bit more checking on who's receiving the funds. You don't want to front a 20-year-old as the head of the company without any shareholding in there so that they can access funds, whereas in the background you have a lot of established individuals being the ones accessing those funds. It defeats the purpose of the whole youth fund initiative.
Right. Now, a lot of the youth who end up unemployed, again, end up within the informal sector as opposed to entrepreneurship. The problem therein being a difficulty in formalizing the small businesses that they start. Just a while ago, I was speaking to the NHIF CEO, and they say the biggest task for them is catering for those within the informal sector. And it's difficult to also have some of these jobs like boda boda operators or mkokoteni guys being formalized as well. Where is the breakdown in allowing or facilitating young Kenyans to formalize the businesses, registration, for example, ensuring they have a certificate of good conduct and all of that?
Well, when you talk to some of these guys, the boda boda guys, or some of the people pulling kokoteni, when they think about paying taxes, when they think about paying for NHIF, I think there's been a lot of fear with regards to those kind of structures before. So I think, again, it will keep getting back to information. It's informing them of the value proposition they get from being registered in formal channels as opposed to working in an informal channel.
Right.
And so if they're not informed, then they make uninformed decisions, and they keep the cycle of having informal businesses that could be formalized and grow to a much larger size.
All right, finally, very briefly, as an entrepreneur, what message would you have to President Uhuru Kenyatta and his administration for the youth?
I think my biggest message would be the initiatives are fine that they're putting forth, but to really see it through to the end, to ensure that they're not being gamed by existing individuals who are established,
right,
to try and find a way of making sure that whether it's funds, they reach the correct people. If it's an information program, the information program is targeting the correct people, to just ensure that whatever is done to completion, rather than ending up as a nice headline that doesn't really get implemented properly to the general public.
All right. Yeah. Many thanks for speaking to us. That is Arthur Mulwa from Armour Logistics. He's an entrepreneur discussing the promises President Uhuru Kenyatta has made with regard to youth employment and small and medium-sized enterprises. We'll take another short commercial break here on KTN News Center. Stay with us. When we come back, more news making headlines.
This is KTN News.